Hello, everyone. You are at a session called Obstacles and Opportunities, the Changing Landscape of Fieldwork in Latin America. My name is Natalie Arsenault. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago, and I'm the one who did a lot of the back-end organization for today's session. Today's session is organized with a number of schools who are members of the Tinker Field Research Collaborative, and we're all working together to do more and to try to connect our students with each other who are doing field work. The people who've participated today include the University of Chicago, San Diego State University, Tulane University, the University of California, Berkeley, the University of Florida, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the University of Kansas, and the University of Texas at Austin. So I want to thank everyone who is participating and who has sent us student panelists to participate in today's panel. I'm going to turn it over now to our moderator, Ramona Perez, who's a professor of anthropology at San Diego State University. Thank you so much, Ramona.
My pleasure. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited about this panel. You know, as a member of the Tinker Collaborative, so many, we spent literally almost the first year just talking about what do we do? We're in the middle of a pandemic, and all of these travel opportunities that we had anticipated have suddenly disappeared. And even as we have moved through the pandemic, we're certainly not over the pandemic, we realize that travel is still very limited for many people, either because our universities themselves are hesitant or because the communities and the places that we had hoped to go to are themselves still restricting access. And we don't see this really letting up for a while. While travel has opened up, there are still many ways and many obstacles and opportunities. So we're hoping that this panel will be the first of many that basically talk about what are our alternatives. How do we rethink field work? How do we rethink engagement with communities? How do we continue to produce the kind of knowledge from Latin America with Latin American voices that become relevant to the way in which we do research? And so being creative has been a significant part of that. We're very, very, very grateful to the Tinker Foundation for being willing to work with us to rethink how we spend some of the travel funds that can no longer be used for actual physical lab travel, but can still open doors, can still open up opportunities. And so our amazing panelists that we have today are panelists who have gone through that and are on the other side and are ready and open to talk to you about that and then to answer any questions. I am a professor of anthropology. I direct our Center for Latin American Studies at San Diego State. But one of the reasons I stepped up to moderate is I also chair the Institutional Review Board for San Diego State. So I'll be asking maybe some of the questions that many of you have about your own IRBs. And IRBs are very different, institution by institution, they're very different. So I'm also happy to answer any questions that the panelists have or anybody else has about them. So I'm going to be quiet now, and I am going to allow our amazing panelists to introduce themselves. They'll introduce themselves, the concept they had on their original research, how they changed it to respond to the moment that they were in, and then some opportunities, some obstacles maybe that they confronted. And then we'll open it up. So without further ado, Alana, do you want to start for us?
Hi, everyone. My name is Elena Ackerman. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a PhD candidate in the anthropology department at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I held the Tinker Research Grant in 2020, right when everything was starting. So I actually wasn't able to start my long-term dissertation research until August 2021. So August of last year. So everything for me was delayed by about 1.5 years. And I'm currently in the middle of my 12-month period of long-term dissertation research. Before the pandemic, my idea had been to travel to Ecuador. My project takes place in Quito, the capital of Ecuador. And my project focuses on the experiences of Colombian refugees who are living in Quito and their experiences of ongoing displacement. Oftentimes, Ecuador is framed by the state, by international organizations like the United Nations, as a place of refuge, as a place of security and safety for refugees. And what I saw during my pre-doctoral fieldwork is that that is not the case at all. People are experiencing ongoing displacement, ongoing forced mobility within Ecuador. Originally, I was supposed to travel to Ecuador and do 12 months of in-person participant observation with refugees from Colombia and Quito, in-person interviews with people to see how they experienced ongoing displacement. That became pretty much impossible during the past couple of years. So my revised plan, this past August, I had to start doing virtual research. So I was located in Illinois, and due to my pre-doctoral fieldwork, I did have contacts. So I was able to contact NGOs who already knew me, and we already had those relationships, and I was able to do recruitment that way. Without those previous relationships, I don't know how I would have done research during the pandemic virtually. So I was able to do Zoom interviews. A lot of my research participants were more comfortable on Zoom, and also WhatsApp. During my pre-doctoral fieldwork, WhatsApp was not a thing. I don't know how it is in other people's research sites, but everyone in Ecuador uses WhatsApp. And that's like my main form of communication with research participants. People send me, or we communicate back and forth with audio messages. So just a lot more informal communication rather than like a face-to-face structured interview or like in-person participant observation, much more WhatsApp and Zoom communication. So some opportunities with that, or just with this kind of revised project, is flexibility for me as a researcher. I am able to be in Illinois if I need to be here. I have family responsibilities. I have a partner who's not able to leave Illinois to accompany me to Ecuador for 12 straight months. So that has been a huge plus, that flexibility for where I'm located. And I do think technologies like Zoom and WhatsApp have been very helpful for different kind of communication. I wouldn't say it's a replacement for in-person interviews and in-person participant observation, but it's just a different form of communication that opens up other types of information and other types of relationships. And in terms of challenges, a big one is not being able to have those spontaneous moments. So previously, like during pre-doctoral fieldwork, I could just drop into an NGO office. And because I had those relationships, that was okay, that was accepted. And I could do participant observation and just have those spontaneous moments that occur. Whereas now everything is much more structured in terms of, okay, I need a schedule, I need a Zoom appointment, I need, this and that. We have an hour and then we all log off. So that part has been more challenging. And another big challenge has been just that ongoing opportunity for communication with research participants. For example, we are always able to find each other on WhatsApp. So I had to figure out what my boundary is. Like, am I going to be available at 10 o'clock at night? Am I going to be available for a conversation on a Sunday? How many research participants do I need now? Because if everyone is constantly communicating and I have a responsibility, I feel like, to be there emotionally for my research participants, can I be there on WhatsApp with 80 people? Or maybe I can only have 30 research participants now. So there's just been a lot of, I don't know if I would call them obstacles, but just challenges to figure out during this time.
I think that's a good way to get started. Giovanna.
Ma aski hypokipanaya yateker masinakaru ukamaraki yatichirenakaru nayan sutija Giovanna Karenchirakusi Bolivia marca chiritwa hayukasti acá University of Florida hacha yatekanyutan abiayala marca chirinaka yatekta acá Center for Latin American Studies ukala ikuteja nayan wakichiwaj kun Hamas Bolivia marcan hiati chawi apnakasiptua. Good afternoon to the organizers, professors, and colleagues in the meeting today. My complete name is Giovanna Karenchirakusi, and I am a master's in Latin American Studies at the Center of Latin American Studies in the University of Florida. And I conducted fieldwork research in summer 2021. So first, I wanted to conduct a fully ethnographic research that was oriented to engage with particular institutions that dealt with indigenous educations and indigenous languages, specifically from the Aymara Nation, both with government institutions and non-governmental institutions. But because of the pandemic, I only focused on one specific aspect about indigenous identities and how the main receivers of education, of indigenous education, are experiencing all the political and policy regulations changes in education in Bolivia. So as my research deals with education and the reconstitution of identity in the plurinational state of Bolivia, specifically in educational institutions, taking into account relevant. So I changed to take account relevant facts and changes in educational projects in previous decades. And also I analyzed how the preservation of language and identity have changed in Bolivia in more than a decade of government of Evo Morales Ayma. Bolivia's constitutional changes and everything. And I explored how the lives and identities of young Bolivians have been affected by such policy changes, using critical approaches such as sociolinguistics and racial-linguistics to consider linguistic inequalities and power relations. And it was possible to examine the experiences of Aymara and non-Aymara students in education because of my positionality as a member of the community being researched. I was able to contact some students, but I also faced some obstacles regarding institutional barriers such as bureaucracy or sending letters. And in some, for example, in one experience of mine was that I sent emails previous traveling back to Bolivia. However, it never got I never got a response, so I had to go. And then when I went there, I realized that it was necessary, like it was a must to send a written, a physical letter to the institution and to have the stamp and the date and everything before contacting the director of that institution. So I experienced that also. And so at the same time, I found opportunities as Elena was mentioning, WhatsApp is the main way of communication, I think, in most Latin American countries, and Bolivia is not the exception. Many people in the countryside, in the peripheries, and in the city use WhatsApp for communication. However, in the countryside or in some vulnerable communities will not have enough money to connect. So I had to help with that, buying some cards so they can have data. So that's how I also managed that obstacle, that the opportunity that kind of looked like an obstacle. I try to help the people that were going to be my informants. So I think there are many other things that we will be mentioning, and I think for now that will be my participation. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Giovanna. Katie.
Can you guys hear me okay? Awesome. So my name is Katie Pritchett. I am a PhD candidate in Latin American Studies at the Stone Center at Tulane University. I'm in my 4th year of the program, but I'm in my 1st year of research. So I was very lucky in that the pandemic hit as I was actually designing the layout and the research design of my project. So I had a little bit more flexibility to decide how I would adapt to the pandemic and the limitations. So I was fortunate enough to go to Mexico City last semester for September through December to do some preliminary research for my dissertation. It's called Wrestling with Masculinities, Exploring the Intersections of Gender, Sexuality, and Nationalism Among Exóticos in Mexican Lucha Libre. So exóticos are wrestlers who are typically assigned male at birth. They perform stereotypically homosexual characters using traditionally feminine moves and gestures as they wrestle, as well as incorporating elements of travestismo. And I chose to work with these performers because they have a very interesting way of complicating gender binaries and traditional gender relations within Lucha Libre. A lot of them are described as delicado, elegante, and recio. So this idea of like delicacy and being tough at the same time. And so what's interesting about this category is that a lot of the wrestlers have a big variety of gender and sexual identities. So not all exóticos are gay, and not all gay wrestlers are exóticos, but I found this category to have a lot of potential performatively. And so for this research, I've been using mixed methods, participant observation, semi-structured interviews, archival research, cultural studies, as well as an interdisciplinary framework. So drawing from sociology, queer theory, gender and sexuality studies. And what I've been trying to understand or explore in my conversations with participants is how they decide to choose this career path, how they are understanding their own gender and sexual identities in relation to the characters they're performing, and how they can use their modes of performance to contest traditional gender relations within Lucha Libre. But as a lot of people have already brought up, even when I was in Mexico City in person, there's still a lot of limitations that I think have really grown during the pandemic with networking with people, and especially building trust with people if you don't have a lot of in-person or face-to-face contact to start out with. In my case, I was networking or trying to recruit people via social media. And while that was accessible in many ways, I was able to look them up online. That also meant that it was really difficult to build trust with them because they're getting a message from a complete stranger about participating in a research project. And I think in a lot of cases, they either didn't see the message or were a little uncomfortable perhaps with a complete stranger wanting to talk to them about their lives. And so in a lot of ways that led to a lot of obstacles with networking. And then eventually, if I did get someone to agree, I think because we didn't have that face-to-face rapport, or maybe the relationship that could be developed by knowing someone in person, that led to a lot of interviews that fell through. And so while that was a difficulty, I also found that being able to conduct these interviews online or in person, it gave me a lot of flexibility to meet the scheduling needs of the participants or to meet their comfort levels. So I was able to, like many people have already mentioned, use WhatsApp. And that has been really great for helping me communicate with participants in a very casual and familiar way that many of them felt more comfortable with. And I would say that, again, another thing that I think the pandemic has made very difficult for researchers is that there's limited in-person events. So participant observation has really changed for me. So I can't exactly go and find myself in an area where a lot of exóticos happen to congregate, right? That's not necessarily a thing that I have access to at this point. But at the same time, this has forced me to pivot to looking at social media accounts, looking at how exóticos are representing themselves online, and considering the other areas where I can actually build connections with people that I might not have considered before. And finally, I think what this has helped me, or what I've had to learn to do through the pandemic, and what I think has enriched my research, is considering the needs of the participants. So many of them mentioned to me that they maybe didn't want to participate in the study because they were really busy. They were trying to hustle. They were trying to get more gigs. They were trying to wrestle in more events. And so taking time out of their day to talk to me about my research wasn't necessarily something that would be financially beneficial to them. And so this has actually helped me reconsider what I could be providing to participants as they participate in my study. What could I do to support them financially or economically that would make it worth their while and also help compensate for the fact that they have been missing out on important work opportunities since the start of the pandemic. And so while that has been required a lot of IRB adaptations and a lot of protocol changes for me, I think it's also been something that's really helped me, I think, make my work more accessible to people, make my work actually beneficial to the people who are in my study.
So many questions for you all already. So I'm very excited about everything that you guys are talking about. Irene.
Hi, everyone. My name is Irene. I'm a third-year PhD candidate in UC Berkeley in the Department of City and Regional Planning. And it's really exciting to hear about everyone's research. I also have questions for you all already. My research site is also Mexico City, and I wanted to interview street vendors. And I actually got the Tinker grant in 2020, and I actually went in summer 2021 because of the pandemic. But it actually allowed me to continue reading since it was like the second year of my program, and it felt like, as Katie was saying, just getting some of the research design set up and just making sure that I had like all these contacts in place. So what I thought about doing initially was interview street vendors in the city and just think about their daily conditions across different locations in the city. What I was thinking about researching the most was how their spatial position and their political position in the city impacted their access to food and their health conditions. I was specifically thinking outside of subway stations and inside neighborhoods and how that shifted across the city. So since there's such a huge diversity of types of street vendors, I really wanted to kind of shed light on those differences and how that affected their daily lives and their daily commutes, and kind of having this idea of how heterogeneous it were. So one of the first obstacle was first having just more paperwork with the university, and having to write some letters asking the dean, my chair, and my advisor for letters in order to go to Mexico City. The other thing that once I got there, since I'm from the city, then that wasn't as bad because I felt like I could navigate the city in a way. But it definitely mattered in terms of having, for example, an internship with an NGO. So I contacted someone through Twitter from an NGO, and she said like, well, we can't really have a formal internship because I'm not actually allowed to interview now, but you could do it. So it was kind of like all these exceptions. So I think it never really hurts to ask. Like everything just seemed like a big hurdle, but I think one of the things that I learned was just go for it and ask. Like even through Twitter, I was like, hey, is this okay? And it felt so unprofessional or so proactive in a way that was a little bit uncomfortable, but I still, when I did it like the outcome was positive in some way. So this is something that I kind of learned from this process. The other thing that really mattered in terms of research was that some of the things that I saw when I was interviewing the vendors is that I was not clear what had happened before and what had changed with the pandemic in terms of substantive some of the substantive questions I had, or some of the substantive material that I saw when I was interviewing. And I had to be really clear about like asking them like, oh, how did that change during the pandemic, and talking more about it. The other thing that happened is as street vendors are kind of on the front line of work, they were one of the first people affected by the pandemic. So every single person I interviewed had someone die from COVID. And it felt at the beginning, I was like, well, maybe people won't be willing to talk to me, but the interviews just became really long because it was maybe talking like an hour about like the things I cared about, but it was mostly talking about someone in their family passing. And it was, so I really thought about, like, I think a little bit like Katie is saying, like where you always, when you're interviewing, you just don't want to be this extractor, right? So you also want to give back something. And I was really thinking about mental health and healing. And since I was caring about health and of the street vendors, this was something that I really thought that maybe since a lot of them belong to membership-based organizations, there could be some sort of program that like really gives them some mental health. I don't know, like I still haven't thought it through, but it was something that just like came out really clearly when I was with people, and that just being heard was something that really mattered. As I think like, well, I think most everyone has said, like WhatsApp also creates this closeness with interviewers. And I think I wouldn't have been able to carry out all these interviews through WhatsApp, and street vendors are really, they don't really want to talk to you or to anyone because there's been this long history of persecution and harassment. So it's really, you need to gain this trust, and you need to have this like rapport with every single person and build it in person. So I think if I didn't go with like double masked and like, and then really created that relationship, it wouldn't have been able to happen through WhatsApp. But I did kind of ask for their numbers later on to follow up on what's been happening now that I'm back in San Francisco. So that's, I think, like I can reiterate for that. And the way that my research changed was more that I think that's like entirely related to the pandemic, but the way that it changed is like once I did this preliminary field work of trying to understand their daily conditions, I really kind of went from like the health aspect to more trying to understand the governance of how street vendors are organized, and how these broader political conditions impact the urban form and where they can be in public space, and how that actually impacts their daily lives. Because if they have to be running away from authority, that's one type of like health conditions or health issues that they're going to be struggling with. But if they have a fixed stall, then it's going to change a lot. So thinking more about how the governance structures are impacting the vendors is something that shifted the way I was thinking about research. And I think I'm going to stop there because I have more things to say, but I can definitely wait.
That's a fantastic start. And you're right, the governance is such a huge issue. You know, I've worked in Oaxaca for over 25 years now. And, you know, each location's governor has specific rules and regulations, and they constantly change as politicians change. So thank you. Anne.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anne Ruel. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a second-year doctoral student of social work at University of Chicago. And I'm interested in the reintegration process of former gang members, and then also the intersections with like as folks are released from prison or juvenile detention in El Salvador. And so I'm interested in just the lived experience, the process of this like kind of this process that gets a lot of different terms applied to it, like reintegration, reinsertion, rehabilitation. So I'm interested in just kind of the lived experience of that, and also the services and kind of the social environment in which it takes place. So policies, and then especially the social services and programs that exist around it, whether they're state, religious, like nonprofit, kind of like international development funded programs. And I initially had framed my project, my grant funded project. It had a very intentional like gender focus on masculinity, and kind of understanding it from the point of view of former gang members that are participants in these different programs. One of the main obstacles trying to plan field work for last summer, I was there for 6 weeks between August and September. But leading up to that, I really wasn't sure if I was going, what programs were going to look like when I was going to be there, just because of how everything just changes so quickly. And if you're not sure about what can be done, it's really hard to get an IRB approval, especially for, like I was thinking about whether or not I was going to be working in juvenile detention centers, which would have been minors or folks on the outside. So a lot of different things. So I ended up focusing just on the programs themselves and doing interviews with social service professionals at these different kinds of organizations, and going for an exempt IRB applications, because my questions were just about what kind of programs do you have? What's the structure? How do people find out about them? Outcomes, kind of things like that. So it wasn't fully considered a human subjects research, but learning about programs through the people work with these participants was really fascinating and opened up a lot of really interesting ways to either continue doing my dissertation research on that level, or maybe getting more of the lived experience of families. One of the other obstacles before I get to the opportunities was again, like kind of this context where eventually, like the day before my flight, I finally was like, okay, I think this is going to happen. I'm actually going to be able to go. But then I got there, and in one of the juvenile detention centers was like fully closed for most of the time I was there because they had an outbreak. And so, you know, like the inconsistency with programs, and if you're working closely with organizations, that was always kind of in flux. But at the same time, that created really interesting opportunities where the facilitators of these programs had a lot of free time on their, not free time, but they had time that they weren't dedicated to providing the workshop or doing like that kind of programmatic work. So they had some time where they were in their homes. And so they had a little bit extra time for interviews. So there were times when I was in El Salvador, but I was still doing Zoom interviews. And I think that was still really valuable because of what some other folks have mentioned about just the importance of kind of the in-between time and the being able to drop into someone's office and kind of just chat with them about whatever's going on or have lunch with people. And so that's the context issue of like the office where I was working a lot of the time got closed once or twice because of COVID, because there wasn't water one day, kind of the things that come up in the field. But I think the other, like the last opportunity that I'd like to highlight was kind of how like a moment of so much struggle really brought out also a lot of like solidarity and creativity, and like it was just like it was a really important moment for the people doing this work to reflect and kind of come together. And like I think like the resistance and the creativity in these moments ended up being really significant. And I kind of hit it at this period where like that was the first trip that I had after so much isolation and so much lockdown and classes online and everything. And so then like being able to be in this moment that was kind of right between COVID waves too, ended up being like personally very, really, really important for me to come back with like kind of with a new vision and drive for like what I'm studying, and having felt like being in the place and having also, you know, in-person interactions and the trust building that others have talked about turned out being was really important just in terms of reconnecting with like relationships I had and building new ones and everything that's going forward since I am so early in my program.
Thank you. I think that's really important to talk about, is also what was happening to us in the process of all of these adjustments. Roberto.
Hello, everyone. My name is Roberto Villan. I am a master's student at the Teresa Lozano Long Institute for Latin American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Speaking of what happened to us, I, as well as those of us who call the COVID cohort, started graduate school in fall of 2020. And so for those of us starting at that time, our graduate school experience, as at least to this point, has been almost all online, has been almost virtual. It's been a virtual graduate school experience, not to mention the effects on field work. And that certainly has had an impact on my own research trajectories and my own academic identities. My current project, similarly to Giovanna, is a history of language revitalization in Guatemala, particularly Mayan language revitalization with an emphasis on Kaqchikel Mayan. I've had the chance to study Kaqchikel now for almost 3 years. And so I had hoped to do a more ethnographically engaged project, some of that deep hanging out that is talked about, and have opportunities to observe, language in use, language in context. Some of those spontaneous moments that Alana was talking about certainly don't have the same feel in a virtual setting, or even online settings. You can get a sense of, the different uses of language in different contexts. But it's hard to replace that in-person engagement with language in particular, given its social and cultural engagements. And so that has, not being able to travel during the time that I had the opportunity to receive a Tinker Field Research Grant in summer of 2021, that inflected, so to speak, my direction and has taken a more historical turn for my master's thesis and my research project. So I'm now looking at a history of Mayan language revitalization and looking at proposing a periodization. So thinking here about 27 years or so, around 1984 to about 2011. So the early 80s were a major a burgeoning moment for cultural and language revindication, particularly Mayan cultural and language revindication in Guatemala, coming out of a 36-year-long civil war, and looking ahead to what roles do language and culture have at the state level, at courts, at the judicial level, education level. So how are Mayan languages, particularly Cachiquel, being integrated at the state level and across other social groups? And so, having the chance to do remote field work with a library such as the Benson Latin American Collection is very helpful. There's some really interesting work being done on post-custodial archives. And I think this sort of gets at, one of the opportunities that maybe comes from, not being able to, the obstacles of not being able to conduct research in person access for archives. I think there's probably, two opportunities and obstacles that I would propose. One is a more kind of empirical sense of, what exactly, what is this, what are the logistics of doing this kind of research, particularly ethnographic research? What are those new technologies? What are those new relationships with collaborators that are taking place and forming? And the other one I think is more conceptual. What is the field? I think this is perhaps an opportunity, at least in ethnography and anthropology, to really rethink, what is the field? What is field work, right? The sort of foreign, exotic, canonically speaking terrain. Now the field is happening here. Our homes have become the field. So what is the field, and what does it mean to get back to normal too? I think there's a certain sense of folks who are wanting to get back to normal research, right? But I think for a lot of us and a lot of communities, normal wasn't working. Normal wasn't normal. So I think there's a really a unique opportunity to rethink about what is the field, what is research, in these times. And so, yeah, that's what I would propose. I think it's also important. I would like to thank the Tinker Foundation for allowing us to use those funds to sustain ourselves, remotely in our homes. I think that's huge. I think that the materiality of research to a certain extent is important. And so having the opportunity to sustain oneself while doing remote virtual research makes it possible to really do this work and to be flexible, to be adaptive in these ever-changing times. So as much as it's been difficult and for myself, having to pivot and change the direction and not being able to do a more deep ethnographic project, looking at language and use, doing participant observation, with state entities, with non-governmental organizations in education, right? I think there's also an opportunity here to really rethink, what does it mean to do research, and how we can better think from and within Latin America. What does it mean to think from and within Latin America in a virtual environment? And how we can meet the needs of our collaborators, right? I think as Katie and Irene were talking about, right? And so that has sort of guided, my my trajectory in my own research, in the formation of my own research project, and thinking about how this historical project, with access to archives and materials here in the US, can better serve the needs of my collaborators, right? How can this historicization, how can this periodization serve their interests, serve local communities on the ground working on language revitalization, right? How can our research from afar meet the local needs of communities in Latin America? And so it's a pleasure to be in dialogue. Thank you again to all the organizers and my fellow panelists for bringing us together. It's a pleasure to be in dialogue with y'all.
Thank you so much. And, this is part of the whole idea of the collaborative, is bringing you all together across our different universities to share these kinds of research experiences. So Matthew John Zinsley has a question that, was actually one of my questions, and that is the use of WhatsApp. And so the whole notion of protecting the identities of people, assuring that your commitment to confidentiality, creating ways in which your access to this personal contact information isn't linked in such a way. So I would love to hear how your IRBs asked you to think about the use of WhatsApp, how you thought about the use of WhatsApp. But WhatsApp isn't the only one. I'm a little intrigued about the use of Twitter, because Twitter is an amazing tool. It's also, it has much less protection in terms of confidentiality, in terms of protecting what people are telling you. So let me open it up, and if you could pop your hand up and let me know who wants to speak first to how you thought about WhatsApp, what you were required to think about, and then how you basically wrote that into your project. Katie, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in sharing all resources and not making other people reinvent the wheel. So I will start off by saying, if anybody wants to see what I've done for my IRB, I'm happy to email it to anybody. One of the things I did for WhatsApp is I was very extensive in my IRB protocol and saying all the possible different platforms I could use to conduct interviews. So I put Zoom, Skype, Facebook Messenger, Instagram, Gmail, WhatsApp, as many platforms as I could possibly name, just to have as many options as possible. And then that way too, if participants weren't comfortable with one, maybe they were comfortable with another. The other thing I did was add the kind of clause saying that there would be a potential for multiple interviews, not just one, which meant that I could continue communicating with people after the initial interview so that I wasn't necessarily intruding on their personal time. They were allowed to engage with me as much as they wanted after that first interview was done. And the other thing that I would recommend to people, my case might be a little bit different, but I created a name preference form because a lot of my participants are actually celebrities. So I gave them the choice on this preference form that the IRB also had to approve to state what they would like me to be calling them. So in any future publications, any presentations, on my notes, do you want to make up a name? Do you want to have, a pseudonym? Do you want me to call you by your legal name, your wrestling name? And so I was able to create a system with that to keep track of who wanted to be called what, and also would help me flag also who was really uncomfortable with their identity being shared and not. And so that's something you might want to consider discussing with IRBs. I don't know if that was just a special case for mine, but I found that to be really helpful.
I'm a little intrigued by that because one of the things that we're very cautious about, and I think all of us experience this when we're working in groups like this, there are some people that definitely want you to let people know that you talk to them, right? The difficulty with that is when you name some and they have profiles and they have ways of responding, it jeopardizes or potentially could jeopardize the identities of others, especially in smaller kinds of community groups where there are ways to link, right? And so I know even in my own work, people would disclose, people would have these long conversations with me and then say, and put that in your book. And they wanted to be named. And I can't do that because it actually, there would be ways to triangulate through that. Did you run into that with your IRB, and how did you handle that? Even, I know you're probably still in the write-up stage and thinking about how you're going to do all of this, but the protection of identities to make sure that others aren't harmed in the process of somebody else having these requests stands out. So I'm wondering if you could address that a little bit.
Yeah, and that's great food for thought. Since I'm really early in the stages, I haven't actually had to consider whether or not to put someone's name. But for now, my default is just redacting any names that they mention and not having that attached right away. So I'm kind of looking at that too, because I'm wondering how I'm going to have, if someone talks about another wrestler in an interview, what am I going to put? So right now, I think my default is just going to be not naming names when we're talking about specific people, but it's something that I'm curious about as well.
So you didn't commit to using their real names or their stage name, even if they wanted to in your work. You just used that as the way in which you corresponded, the way in which you engaged with them individually, but you didn't commit to saying, yeah, definitely, I'll use your name in writing.
I told them that I'll use the name that they prefer in writing. But I guess what I'm saying is that at this point, if I have one participant and they are starting to talk about other people, I don't know that I would necessarily connect or say who said what about who at this point.
Does anybody else want to talk a little bit about WhatsApp? Because I know that we have a whole bunch of different ways in which we ask people to evidence how they are going to protect identities. And I think Alana's issue of boundaries is also important. And I know even with my students, especially in some of the internships, because of our location on the US-Mexico border, I have a lot of internships in shelters and different locations like that in Mexico, and students always want to give their cell number. And I'm like, don't, you can't do that. There are ways in which you have to protect them from you, as well as you, in terms of understanding that this is a moment in your life. And there's just got to be a way in which we understand that. So does anybody else want to speak to that? I mean, if WhatsApp is going to be our new way of thinking about things, of engaging, there are limitations to it. I mean, you all have talked about what gets missed is body language. What gets missed is context. What gets missed is you really don't know who's around them. And I know, when I teach, I run an ethnographic field school, so I know one of the things that I'm constantly trying to get students to understand is if you're talking with somebody and they pause, they hesitate, they change the subject, you need to be really conscious of what just happened around them to understand why they all of a sudden felt threatened in some kind of way. Who walked in, who walked by, who elevated their voice so that they think the neighbor is listening. There's all that context that just doesn't exist in WhatsApp and even through Zoom, right? I mean, we're so used to being in a box now. There's that moment, and I'm sure Roberto, with being the COVID cohort, you appreciated that when you got to meet your colleagues for the first time and actually outside the box. But Alana, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple quick comments to what you were asking about, and also just a couple quick comments to some other things that came up as other people were talking. For WhatsApp, my university's IRB was mostly concerned with recording. So I just had to say that I wouldn't record, like if we had a WhatsApp video chat, or like I would copy and paste WhatsApp messages that I thought could be helpful for my dissertation into a Google Doc, and then upload that to a secure box file. So it was mostly about like not recording and also putting information in secure spaces. So that's what I was mainly thinking about in terms of the IRB and WhatsApp. Another point about the IRB, maybe I didn't make this clear in my initial presentation, but I was going back and forth between Ecuador and Champaign. So I was in Ecuador for a few months, and now I'm back in Champaign for a few months. I'm going back to Ecuador next month for a couple months. And something that was really helpful for me with the IRB was putting all of that into my initial IRB application without specific dates of where I was going, when I was going to be in each place. Because the IRB is very overwhelming in general, the application process. And to have to update it like every 2 months if I didn't know where I was going to be and what I was going to be doing. So I just said at the beginning, I'm going to be doing 12 months of fieldwork or research, I actually called it. And sometimes I'll be in Ecuador and sometimes I'll be in Champaign. I don't know the exact dates, but between August 2021 and August 2022. And I didn't know if that would be okay with the IRB, and it was. So that was really, really helpful so that I didn't have to be updating every 2 months to have that flexibility. The really tough bureaucracy with moving back and forth between Latin America and the US was actually with my long-term funder. So the Tinker was fabulous for getting me to Ecuador and getting me started, but I needed and was very privileged to obtain long-term funding for dissertation research. But there was a lot of bureaucracy with them. A lot of bureaucracy with my university, with particular deans. I think someone mentioned having to go through various offices to get permission to actually travel to Latin America. And that was actually the most difficult part, especially when I felt like personally, like I know when I feel safe to be in a particular space. And if I don't feel safe and I really want to leave. But I had to constantly be proving that to everyone else in institutions. So that was really challenging. And then the last thing I wanted to mention really quickly is just Roberto's point about rethinking the field. And that made me think about how I've really been referring to what I do as research lately rather than as field work. And I think that's because there's so many normative assumptions and expectations that come with the word fieldwork. An idea of where the researcher is supposed to be located. So if I'm doing field work on or about, Quito, I should be in Quito physically. But when I use the term research, that just carries more flexibility in my mind for where I can be located and what that can actually look like. I don't know if that's productive, or maybe we can, start talking about fieldwork in a different way so that it can also carry that flexibility. Maybe what we're doing is fieldwork, even if we're located in the United States or somewhere else other than our field site. But I have noticed that I've been changing the way I use language and referring to what I do as research. So I'll leave it at that for now.
There's actually a lot of literature on that. We've been redefining the field for quite some time because so many people, actually, I would say in the late 80s, early 90s, as more people started to do urban work and they did work in the US, there became the whole question of the field is actually my neighborhood. The field is actually my apartment. The field is actually anywhere I'm doing my research. And so the field is some kind of exotic other place. We've been trying to blow that up for quite some time. And, the field itself became a concept in order to differentiate the research that's done in a lab, the research that's done in these other locations, right? Because people would say, well, I'm going to go to my lab now and work. And so there was this clear demarcation about, where you did your work. And so then the notion of the field became really important. But you're absolutely right. We're all in the field right now in many ways. We're learning. We're using this information. This information is going to become part of something that we do. And language is so important, right? The way in which we talk about something, the way in which we engage through that language becomes really important. Giovanna.
Yes, just a quick participation maybe of what you just said before engaging to the previous question. Yeah, language for me, to being able to speak Aymara was very, very useful for me, and also Spanish to communicative things that happened in the interviews. But regarding the question about the WhatsApp and how, so similarly to Katie, I was in the IRB process. I was asked how I was going to recruit my participants of the study. And so I had to also provide like possibilities, other possibilities that in potential issues that I would have. And so I first did the email contact and also phone numbers, but the WhatsApp emerged from the participants actually, because when I was provided access to phone numbers, I called and to the class representatives or to the group community representative, and then they told me, no, let's speak via WhatsApp, it's easier for me. So that's how it emerged first. And then also I had to have approval of a digital flyer where they got access to a link where they could fill a Google Drive form that also was protected, where they could fill all the general information, and if they were they wanted to consent their participation or the information that they were sharing, and all the information about the what is the research is going to be about. And so the informed consent and the interview protocol was very important for me when talking to participants. And I also had I want to mention this, I had people that wanted to do Zoom or WhatsApp calls or Zoom meetings, and also people that prefer to do the interviews in person. So that made me think about other ways to manage data. And because I had mixed data now, and I have to consider, or also gave me the opportunity to make comparisons about how the interview in person was and how the interview in Zoom was, like all the different aspects that could intervene in their on what they were saying in the interviews in person and in Zoom. That was a very good opportunity to see that, and I included that in my research. So that also had to do with the results of the research, right? So that was also something I wanted to mention. Thank you.
I think that's fantastic. And that's exactly what will make your moment, your research, for all of you, for all of us that are doing it at this time, is really talking about, especially when we're moving between two different kinds, right? Where some of it's going to be face-to-face and some of it's always going to be through some kind of social media platform. What are the differences and what kinds of different relationships emerge from that? And does it impact, the way in which people talk and think and engage with us? I think that's a really beautiful and important conversation to have, especially since this is not going to go away, right? This isn't a moment that's going to then convert over. I think there are ways in which this opportunity to engage in this way has redefined a lot of things for us in the same way that cell phones did for many diasporic communities, right? The way in which video did, where you could actually video a fiesta, or you could video an important ritual and then share that with your sister community, your community members who now were in another place, so that people still felt engaged. There are so many different ways in which you are actually marking. You are the platform, you are the foundation for how we are thinking about future research. And I think that's important. And your IRBs are learning alongside you. As somebody who's chairing this, I can tell you, your IRBs are learning alongside you. And the obstacles that you run into, I think, are important to engage with and go back and report on, because it helps people who don't do what we do, but who are reviewing our work on these boards, understand how ethnographic work, archival work, these kinds of things function, that they're not necessarily, that don't fall within the biomedical realm, which is what most institutional review boards are situated in, right? So please share what you're doing more broadly. Irene.
I wanted to mention something related to what you just said, Ramona. And I think that when I was doing the IRB, I was stressing out a lot because I didn't know, and because you don't know how fieldwork is gonna go, and you don't know enough about the topic, or you feel you don't know enough, right? So there were all these questions that sometimes I was like, well, I don't know how I'm gonna recruit people, because my thought was, I've been in Mexico City eating tacos all my life. I'm just gonna pack my bag and go and ask, right? But then obviously I was so naive. Like, first of all, people were not going to give me any information if I just arrived. And second of all, like, it's this process is also to kind of, it's to protect people's privacies, but it's also to protect yourself as a researcher, right? So it goes both ways. And so I think when I was doing this, the IRB and thinking about recruitment, I also had to write a script on how I was going to approach interviewers. And one thing that I would like to say for whoever is writing an IRB right now is, like, you don't have to stress as much. You can make it kind of broad, and then, as like Ramona is saying, like, you can really just, after, you can go back, and as Alana was saying as well, you can go back and tweak it, and it doesn't have to be like the most precise thing ever. So I think, like, actually now, if I was reading it right now, like what I wrote before, and it's like, well, I was like, wow, that's not how it went, right? Like, when I recruited, it was actually, as I mentioned earlier, through this organization that I contacted through Twitter, and this point of entrance was the one that really allowed me to, I had an idea of where I wanted to go in the city, but then the people that I talked to kind of were chosen through that platform. And that's just because how it's organized politically and how people are organized in vending. So actually, I read this and I was like, well, I had no idea at the time that that's how it worked, right? So this is something that even now, thinking about how some certain platforms could facilitate these kind of conversations with interviewers, I really think that for me, I had to go in person. Like, it was just really, it would have been really hard to analyze how things were working, particularly because I'm in planning and I care about public space and how things are playing out outside. So, like, now I'm still in contact with vendors through WhatsApp, and they send me pictures of how things are looking, and how there's this like urban renewal project, it's a mall, and they send me pictures of how the construction is going, but I know how it looks, and I built this relationship previously, and I also asked for their consent, and they know who I am, right? So I can, like, you build that relationship, and then you can continue on. Like in my case, right? I think like other cases, it could be easier to, from the start, either have a Skype, Zoom, WhatsApp call, or whatever from the start. But in my case, with my research, I felt like I really needed to be in person before. And the other thing that I wanted to say, but I'm not sure why I wrote this down now, Elena was talking about safety. And I just think that for me, the other thing that I wanted to just bring to the conversation was this point of entrance, like this point of entry with partnerships, and how that really changes your research. So depending on those partnerships that you make, it really matters also in terms of safety, and just connecting it to WhatsApp. If you're going to certain neighborhoods and your field work that are kind of, you feel unsafe, WhatsApp becomes kind of a great tool. Also, if you want to have your location, like GPS activated, so having an external battery, so you keep your phone charged because you're going to be doing interviews, and then also having it as a GPS if whoever in your family is worried about you or friends. These are like the things that I wanted to bring to the conversation in terms of safety and partnerships.
No, I just want to take a moment and stress that institutional review boards are concerned with risk. They're concerned that that your research will not increase the risk of the people that you hope to engage with. And so I think we get so caught up in thinking that we have to cross all these T's and dot all these I's that we walk away from the deeper and richer conversation of, this is my research question. This is what I want to know. Is this a vulnerable group? Are these people whose voices I can help bring forward? And when I'm doing that, can I protect them? Can I make sure that what I do, no matter how harmless I think it is, vulnerability is not something that we understand well enough unless we're actually in the site and we know the experiences they're having. And so I think this is the thing with WhatsApp, and I know it's something that we think about a lot. here at San Diego State, especially with the many vulnerable populations that are on the border, right? And that is, how do you make sure that if your phone gets stolen or something like that happens, that somebody can't access your WhatsApp and all of a sudden have this information that you've been gathering on people within your WhatsApp, and your WhatsApp is not fully protected, right? So there are ways in which you need to move that information off of your WhatsApp someplace else, and then remove those conversations. The other thing I want to stress is I think you really should think about when you use WhatsApp, creating a research identity, a WhatsApp profile that is linked to your research. And that goes to Alana's question of where are my boundaries? How am I going to handle that? By having a research identity on WhatsApp, it gives you a little more protection in terms of your own self. I mean, we go through that even with our cell phones, right? So very few of us have office phones anymore. I actually have one, I just never answer it because I'm so busy, not because I don't want to talk to anybody. But, there are ways in which, I think a lot about, my cell phone as access to all these other places. So I want you all to think about, and other people to think about, creating research WhatsApp identities that can be protected in that way. There are some questions in our Q&A that I want to pose to you. The first is, what are the most challenging institutional constraints that have limited your fieldwork during the pandemic? And they're thinking about funding, policies, university policies, or organizational policies, that this notion of excessive caution during this time. So does anybody want to try? There's so many, right? But there's so many of these that actually happen just in any kind of field research. But Anne.
Yeah, I kind of talked about the insecurity of like whether or not I was going to go, kind of like until the very day before. And so like I got my award in 2021, spring of 2021. So like I first got it, and it was like, okay, you have the funding, but you probably won't be able to go. And then the university opened like, well, there might be exceptions made to the travel ban policy. You can fill out this paperwork. You probably still won't get approved, but you should do it anyway. And so I did it. And there were like two separate forms, one for my department and one for like the university level. And then those got through. And then right before I left for El Salvador, the COVID numbers were really far down and everyone's feeling good again. And so then they said, okay, if the country is like a level 2 travel advisory country, then you don't even need those forms anymore. You can just go. And then by the time I got there, then El Salvador went back to a level 3, but I was there anyway. And I already had the approval. So that's not even including the IRBs, but that's kind of like, that's just an example of like over the course of like 3 or 4 months, all of the different messaging you can get and confusion around what might happen. So I hope that's the only time I have to go through that, but I'm not sure what the rest of the university is
if you work in Latin America, you're going to have to do it in a whole variety of different ways. There have been so many times, I working in Oaxaca during the teacher strike, during all these different things. I've had to have evacuation plans in place. I've had to have, all different kinds of things to think about. And I think that's important. I think it's important for people who do urban work, even in the US, right? You need to think about safety. You need to think about risk. You need to think about all the different things that can happen. And we don't always want to do that, but it's important. Your IRB is good for a year, right? You get a 12-month IRB that can be extended. And so I love the idea that you build into your IRB the possibilities, right? As well as what you know you can do. There are ways in which that would change, but modification should always be done rather quickly. If you go in for a modification on your IRB, it shouldn't take as long if everything else is in place. So I also don't want anybody to be intimidated with the idea that they don't want to go in and do a modification because it's going to take, another 2 months. It shouldn't. It shouldn't. Giovanna, you had your hand up.
Yes. I just wanted to, as Annie was talking, I remembered some institutional challenges that I faced also that I think I shared at the beginning, but maybe I can get a little deep. But first, even though you do your work before or previous, you investigate and you do research on the websites of the institutions, and you know who you are going to go with, but sometimes websites are not updated, and so it was a different name, a different director, and so I think we have to be ready to, you know, to act in that moment when you find out that that's not the person you're looking for. And also, as I shared at the beginning, the institutional barrier, that was a bureaucratic one. So the letters. So I found out that sometimes physical letters are more effective than emails, and to go to the place, to request appointment, to be very knowledgeable about how the institutions or your partners are functioning at that moment. That was very helpful for me. Thank you.
I think it's really important that people understand Latin America as a region is still very face-to-face. Relationships are how they understand their world. And you know, sometimes it's very difficult for people who are US bound or even European bound, where individualism and the idea of this kind of separation between the personal self and the business self exists. And that's not what we're dealing with. So I think that's the other thing that we spend a lot of time working with our colleagues in understanding is actually how we have to respect and understand the communication, the cultures that we're dealing with. I also want to tell you that every IRB is supposed to have graduate student representation. So that's also some place where you can make a huge impact, is by volunteering, because making sure that there are qualitative researchers on the institutional review board is critical. And it's fascinating, truly. I mean, I know I'm a nerd, but I love reading other people's research and really diving into it and understanding it. It's just amazing to me. So another question was, and I'm not sure I'm going to get all of this right. So it says, I wonder if any panelists faced conflicts between goals of language preservation / maximum accessibility and longevity of data, and the IRB goal of protecting, hiding, and making data inaccessible. I'm not sure I understand that IRB goal, but does anybody want to approach that question?
And language documentation and language description. I think maybe the question is getting at there with language preservation, and some of the tensions between maybe the goals of your collaborators to proliferate, to spread, to disseminate language research, but also some of the goals of the IRB to protect your collaborators, right, and to minimize risk, and we know that language has political connotations, and so speaking and using indigenous languages, when in many cases, as for a broader field of endangered languages, operate in very politically subordinated contexts. These are very much oppressed languages to a certain sense, and therefore its speakers and its users as well. And so I think this question is particularly salient and really gets at some of those broader tensions that are maybe felt between the goals of communities to use research to expand their audience, right? Use my real name. People want to know that. I want people to know that you talk to me and I talk to you, right? I think specifically in my case, maybe Giovanna has a different take on this. I haven't had the opportunity to work with specifically on language preservation, on language documentation. Fortunate to have to work with a language that has been documented for some time. But I think there's certainly concerns and making sure from the beginning that I think people are clear where everyone stands, right? And making it clear to participants of what are your goals and what are their goals, and making sure that that comes through in your IRB, and that we're aware of these political contexts, particularly language, right? But we're aware of these broader political contexts in which we're operating and our collaborators are operating as well.
A really good reflection, Roberto. Avery has a question from the University of Michigan. She says, I'm curious if any panelists had conversations with their participants about their experience with virtual interviews. What factors affected participant comfort and/or hesitancy? In other words, we're talking about our own experiences with it, but did anybody actually spend time talking with people about, are you okay on this? What did that feel like having this conversation through social media or on WhatsApp? Alana.
I was actually surprised how comfortable my research participants were with virtual interviews. I did virtual interviews on Zoom, and I think just because so many people were fluent in WhatsApp that it just kind of felt more natural on Zoom. So I was actually really surprised how comfortable people were with that. And I did ask people, like, what was this experience like? Normally I would be there in person. And some people did say, like, oh yeah, if you were actually here, like we could have a longer conversation and we could like, yeah, it would be more comfortable and I could share things. But for example, someone told me that last year, and when I went to Ecuador, I met them in person and we were able to kind of get together multiple times and get to know each other in person. And they were actually just as like open and welcoming to the relationship as they were over Zoom. So I think sometimes there's an idea that maybe in person might be like people might be more comfortable, but it's not always the case. I think especially people who are like fluent in like virtual platforms like Zoom or WhatsApp, like they actually are pretty comfortable with it. And I think it also had to do with the fact that for my particular research, I was talking with people who were in very precarious situations. Like they were very concerned about their safety. Like these are people in Quito who have persecutors who are after them. And to know that they're talking with someone located in the US who might be doing a project that reaches a US-based audience, I think, first of all, knowing that maybe I was a little bit removed, like geographically at that time that we were speaking, did make them feel more comfortable. The fact that they could be located in their homes, that they didn't have to leave and take a bus somewhere and put themselves out in public at risk. So I think there were several factors that made them feel more comfortable. The fact that I am white and at a US-based university and might have access to helping them kind of spread information that they want spread to that public. So I think there were a lot of things that people maybe implicitly and also explicitly made clear about why they were comfortable, and people who weren't comfortable participating didn't participate. Like there were people who I reached out to and they did not answer my request for an interview, which is absolutely fine. But so there were definitely people who were hesitant or who weren't comfortable, but they did make it clear, and we didn't engage in that research. So.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a shift. I think it's been coming for some time where many communities who are talking to family members and community members across space and time have been using cell services and have been using these kinds of things for a while. So this is just that kind of next step. The difficulty, I think, for those of us that do a lot of ethnographic work is understanding context and how much context can be jeopardized in that. And I see your hand, but I want to address the anonymous attendee who was asking about language protection. And they say that if you have a language documentation grant that emphasizes archiving a language and publishing, revitalizing it, while you have a grant and data management plan that says you should protect identity of speakers and destroy the data or keep it hidden, you don't have to do that. You can have the names of your participants very much a part of your research. Human subjects research doesn't require that you not use people's names. And in something like language documentation, where those speakers, it's important to know who those speakers are. You know, I have a colleague who's been working with the last 3 speakers of a particular language in Tecate, in Baja, among the Mexican Kumeyaay. And they're in their 90s now. It's super important that their names, that their family recognizes who they are and the contributions they've made. We protect identity, or we want to protect identity, where that identity can be used in such a way that they become vulnerable to that data. So if you're not asking them about personal reflections, you're not asking them to comment on the value or the worth of language, then there's no reason in the world why you can't have a data management plan that allows them to be known. I think we just have to be really clear in our research what that means, and in our disclosures when we do the informed consent, right? That we give them the option, we ask them the option, we make sure they understand the pros and cons of disclosure. But for me, the most difficult part is where I realize that some of my work is going to be confidential and some of it's not. And like I said, it doesn't take very long for people to start triangulating and say, okay, well, you know, this conversation over here that's named means that they're linked over here. And, you know, it's really difficult, especially when you talk to community leaders who want to make sure that you use their name, right? That becomes something different. But Anne, I'm going to let you talk.
Yeah, I was responding not totally to the question about, you know, like what it was like doing Zoom interviews, but I was also thinking a lot about just recording and kind of the politics of recording versus taking notes during interviews, and especially in El Salvador, where the current president is incredibly authoritarian, has been taken advantage of the pandemic and the support he's gotten to erode a lot of civil rights, and it's become much worse, even worse lately. And so I thought I asked a lot of people that do work down there about, you know, what they thought about recording, you know, if it's with professionals versus people who are more directly involved with gangs and everything. And so I did a little bit of both, because most people said yes if I asked if we could record, and Zoom just like facilitates that so much, like especially now that we're more familiar with it. And it was really interesting because on the one hand, like recording meant that, you know, like people's phones and computers are like have been hacked, like journalists, like they've found software showing that their phones have been hacked. The government's not friendly to outside intervention right now. There's really a lot of risks going on, and then at the same time, like having a recording meant that, so like the recording existed as something that could be like taken by someone else. And it also seemed to give some security that like what was said in the recording was what was like, there was more control over that, because then what we talked about after the recording wasn't part of the research anymore. So like then I would have like, there'd be these informal conversations afterwards where they would like kind of lower their voice, like, and, you know, tell me additional things, but that wasn't part of the recording. So like there was this really interesting separation going on of what was being disclosed. And now as I'm considering going back, like that's the political, like it's gotten even worse for anyone who's associated with gangs at all. But it's something I think about a lot, because like the field of reintegration is so small that like the triangulation that you're talking about really would be quite easy, even though I'm, you know, using pseudonyms and whatever. There just aren't very many people providing these kinds of services.
Yeah.
So I think
yeah, and it's really important that you know your field site in that way. And if you are new to your field site, that you find people who have been in that field site for a while to help you navigate and understand that. And, you know, that's the other point of this collaborative, you know, is if you don't have somebody in your center or on your campus who has worked there, we're all over the place, you know, and we have all agreed as part of this collaborative to be open to the opportunity to speak to students and researchers who are coming into the areas that we know well. And you know, I so appreciate everything that you're saying, because you know, and so it's important that you put in those extra steps to protect. It's like on Zoom, one of the things that I always ask people to think about is making sure before you start recording that it's a black box and that they change their name, that there is no name on their box that can be linked to them in any way. So you don't want the visual as it is, the voice is an identifier, but at least you've gotten rid of the image and you've gotten rid of the other things. And if they can still see you, sometimes that's the most important thing. It just makes your work that much more difficult because you're not seeing them. But like you said, once you stop the recording, you can come back on and engage and follow up on some of those questions that then go into your field notes, which I can never stress enough are critical to the kind of research that we do. We are at time. I want to address the one last question from someone who asked about a class project that they did, and then they would now like to use that data. If the class project did not receive an IRB approval for any kind of human subjects engagement, then no, you can't use it towards anything that would be in a published work. That the people were not informed properly, the consent wasn't drawn, the parameters aren't there, so no, you could not use it. That's something that we really want to stress with faculty, is if you have a really fascinating class project, you need to understand that it can be background data for future research, but the data you are collecting cannot be used in the actual data analysis. And yes, the recording of this webinar will be available. I'm going to let Natalie talk about where exactly we're going to have it and how it will be available. But yes, absolutely, it's going to be available. I want to thank all of you for being a part of this, for sharing your experiences. I hope it was as beneficial for you as it was for those of us who listened to your work and listened to everything that you had to say. I want to thank the University of Chicago, the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Chicago, for putting this all together for us and for making sure that it is available in the future. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Natalie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. I just put in the chat. We will share, once we've captioned the video and finalized it, we'll share the link with everyone who attended. It will also definitely be posted on the Chicago class website and YouTube channel. And then we will share it through the collaborative as best as we can. So thank you, everybody, for attending. I think this was an amazing session. It was so great to hear from all of the students. I'm inspired by the work that you're doing. And I hope we get to have more conversations like this in the future.